Welcome and thanks for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, we'd encourage you to please leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. This really helps other folks find out about the podcast, our great guests, and the wisdom that they have to share. So without further ado, on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Mr. James Brasuell, Managing Director of Planetizen. Is that correct pronunciation there?
Yeah, you got it. I'm the managing editor, but yeah, you got all the tough pronunciations. Good job.
Well, I can go home happy at this point. Then,
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
I hope you're doing well, recovering from Thanksgiving, and I wonder if you could kind of share a little bit about your background and how you came to be doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. Planetizen is a national website that it's kind of a niche publication designed specifically to provide a lot of resources, a variety of resources for professional and academic planners. Our readership is mostly people who are working for cities or county governments or also working for private planning or urban design firms. But then there's also a lot of professors and students who come to our site for news, commentary. We also have a lot of job training resources, a store. We've been around since 2000 and we've really pushed a lot of different products out over the years. I've been at Planetizen since the very beginning of 2014. I've been a journalist writing about planning since 2005, and I got to the topic of planning as a journalist definitely by a circuitous route. I was originally a river guide while I was working through undergraduate and graduate school, and I had an interest in river restoration, specifically habitat restoration in a very northern part of California. And when I came to Los Angeles to start a real career, or a more professional career anyways, they had just undergone a process of master planning a river revitalization plan. And it was a very large deal in Los Angeles at the time. And it was just sort of the right place at the right time to get a job at a publication called The Planning Report. And so I've been focusing on local and regional and now national planning and land use, architecture, urban design issues for a long time. It's been a really great career so far.
Well, very interesting. I wonder, kind of, you talk about it specifically as a planning thing, which I think is you guys have positioned yourself really well in that urban planning field. But it's I'm kind of interested in the language that happens around this. You mentioned several other terms there, but I think even these ideas of placemaking and community development seem to be in vogue in some ways as well.
Yep. This is something that we struggle with, actually, or I particularly struggle with. I think that the term urban planning gets used as the shorthand to capture what is really a much more broad and varied professional practice and academic study. And I think that part of the reason people use urban as the modifier of this is because there is a popular, new awareness about cities and the benefits of density and multimodal living and the quality of life that's available in cities. I mean, this is probably a pretty common narrative for anybody who's listening to this podcast. But a lot of the planning, the real work of planners is in more specific or even non-urban conditions. If you're talking to the majority of planners, for instance, that live in the state of Pennsylvania, their concerns are with stormwater infrastructure. And there's a lot of other examples, but there's just a lot of places in this country and in the world that deserve attention and care for the future livability of these places that it's not fair to describe as urban. I think that when you rely on that term urban, you start to neglect some places that really deserve the same amount of care as any cities do.
Do you think that universities have come to understand that and have changed kind of how they teach planning, or is that still kind of coming around in some ways?
I think you can see some of this, some of the priorities of a university's planning program in the name of their the usually it's a master's program that for planning. There's definitely a lot of undergraduate degrees, but you'll see urban and regional planning. You'll see community planning also used. You'll start to see that they're not quite settling on one term, and that usually reflects the strengths of their faculty. But I think that a lot at the academic level, a lot of planners are sort of fascinated with the idea of urban design, and that has definitely influenced the trajectory of a lot of thinking of students when they come out of their programs, and also a lot of academic inquiry also.
Interesting. I think that part of what we're most interested in at Expo and on this podcast too is that really that how intersectional all of this is, and that I think I would argue we're starting to see that planning has to take into account education and has to take into account income inequality and all of these different things in many ways, and it makes the field all that much more fascinating, but all that much more difficult to get a handle on in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it maybe becomes it's harder to make blanket statements once you start to learn more about this field. So that idea of a better city, it gets complicated really quickly. But if you're talking about specific outcomes and specific results, that can be actually really helpful. So that intersectionality that you're talking about is a really helpful way to approach it. And that's when I'm writing something like this out, that's the little tag I put on it, is that there's a lot of related fields and a lot of related concepts that go into planning.
I wonder, your background being journalism and working on this, what is in many ways a journalism platform, a media platform, and what role you think that plays in furthering these conversations about planning and really moving things in the right direction in some ways.
Yeah, I think it plays a huge role, and a lot of my awareness about the benefits of cities and a lot of my love for the city where I live now, which is Los Angeles, came from reading the right websites. And I think that back in the mid 2000s, there was kind of a rebirth of local journalism. For me, it happened at Curbed Los Angeles. And there was one particular reporter there, Dakota Smith, who's now at the LA Times by way of the Los Angeles Daily News also. But she was covering planning in a way that nobody else was at the time. For a blogger, she had an office at City Hall and was just really exposing the importance of these conversations that were happening around planning in the city of Los Angeles at the time in a way that immediately captured my attention. And I saw how my interests in watersheds and water and rivers, how that totally related to the conversations about housing or development that were happening in Los Angeles at the time, or other types of infrastructure, transit. These were all big conversations that are still going on in Los Angeles. And I think that there's a tremendous benefit that, Streets Blog also has done it. Different cities have different resources. Different cities have beat reporters that are really excel at this. Some of my favorite beat reporters in the country are in cities like Dallas or Louisville, Cleveland. And then, there's just so much value out there, and there's so many people doing really good work. Really taking difficult concepts and making them much more clear, but also connecting those concepts to the interests of individuals and communities all over this country.
Well, it's interesting that you really take it back. Even though you're working at kind of this national and even international scale, you're taking it back to that very local reporting, and that's particularly interesting to me because I think that we're seeing. Well, yes, that there was perhaps a growth in some citizen journalism in the blogging sphere and things like that, that a lot of communities are seeing the journalism stripped away from their communities and are having more and more trouble finding people to articulate what's happening in some ways.
Yeah, I think that you have to be discerning, and maybe that's definitely a challenge for anybody who's looking for the best possible information. And the reporting that comes out of these local blogs, even my local blogging work in the past, there are limitations in fact checking and research, and you have to take that into account. But there are obvious clues when you're reading these things as to what kind of politics you're dealing with, what kind of evidence you're dealing with, and it takes practice in reading these people and these types of websites, and just accepting that you're going to get some of that filter there. But everyone has resources. You just need to find the right people and the right outlets. And that's not to say that there haven't been setbacks. Just recently, DNA and some of the IST sites, like Gothamist and LAist, I'm sure some of the listeners are aware, those sites got shut down, and certainly those were some of the best local resources out there. It's still the Wild West in media. There's the mainstream media sites are getting cut, and we're still trying to figure out what the future of this conversation is going to look like. But Twitter has been a huge benefit to me, and you can really curate and collect a variety of voices and some really valuable perspectives that you're not going to get in some of those other mainstream sites. So there are a lot of options still out there.
I wonder too. You mentioned earlier broadening this idea of planning beyond just the traditional city stuff, and I wonder, how do you encourage smaller communities to kind of not rely on their local newspaper or their local television stations, and take advantage of their resources to kind of explore other ways of engaging with these issues and building their own networks of information in some ways?
Yeah, that's always going to be, we're talking about where the rubber hits the road to some extent. You can talk a big game about engagement and about bringing new voices into the conversation, but it's still been less than the results have been less than desired, I think, in almost every case. I can't from the back of my mind pull an example of a city that's really done a standout job of bringing new voices into the conversation. There are more resources online through social media. You still tend to get some of the same sort of single platform engagement. The people with very specific interests are the ones that are engaging with a lot of these planning processes in public. I don't know what the answer to that is, other than people have to keep trying, and they have to deploy new technology. There are new commenting features available online. There just have to be higher standards in how planning departments present information online. The PDF needs to end in a lot of cases, and there are a lot of resources. But it's also understandable that a planning department wouldn't have the expertise in house to launch a website that's fully interactive and goes mobile and commenting in a meaningful way. It's just tough.
Well, again, that kind of goes back to that intersectionality, that you can't just be in one space anymore. That I think that there was a time when facilitation skills in urban planning were perhaps looked down upon, but we now see that those are some of the most important things that you can learn. And I imagine that communication and online media are going to be just as important as some of the other tools that planners have moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right about that. The new value, it's not that new. It goes back to, and this will be familiar to a lot of your listeners, to Jane Jacobs, and sort of a reversal of how the planning process happens. It's not as frequently a top-down process as it used to be, and that there have been some people who have made fairly good arguments that that's been bad for the planning process. But I don't think that you can really make a good argument that people, community members, and stakeholders shouldn't be involved in these processes. So you're going to have a lot of different voices at the table. Sometimes certain traditional voices are going to dominate the discussion. It's going to be a case by case problem solving exercise anytime you go to the public with some sort of vision for the future.
I'm intrigued in terms of your guys' platform. I think that one of the things that it does best is it allows for the sharing and circulation of both success stories and statements of what common issues are amongst communities. And I wonder, kind of, when you guys are looking at stories and things along those lines, of how you're thinking about them in terms of the broader scope of what you're looking at.
I have a pretty holistic view. I think this comes back to me down the river, and I just see that everything matters, and and all places. I said this before, but all places deserve care and attention. So, as far as I'm concerned, if we're talking about a vision for the future, if we're talking about any sort of hard or soft infrastructure that can contribute to the quality of life and the social or economic mobility of a community, then it's fair game. I stick by my guns on that, sometimes to the detriment of our traffic. You know, I keep track of what stories are doing well and not well, and I've posted on this in the past. I did a list early in my tenure of the least popular stories that I'd posted, and a lot of them had to do with things that I find totally essential, topics like wildfire. Two of the least popular posts I had at the time were about the urban wild interface expanding and how that was increased the threat of catastrophic wildfire. And, that problem has only been more and more in the public view and more apparent. But it's hard sometimes to get people to read that. I'm going to keep posting stories like that. And I hope that even if they're not immediately popular, what we're doing is creating an archive or a record of all the different inputs and related stories. And it's all going to be together in one place. And if you needed to put your finger on some sort of pulse of planning or the way that communities were trying to plan for the future at any point since our website was founded, I hope that you can come to our archive and do that.
Well, I imagine there's also this thing of you want people, even if they don't necessarily, click through on that article and read it, that they're at least being introduced to a topic so that when someone brings it up in the future, they can be like, oh, I remember that, I didn't read it, but I saw that was something that maybe I should be thinking about in some ways.
Yeah, I think that the way that our site is set up also, we're really trying to, and these are choices that come down to the sentence level on any post that we're putting up on the site also, is, this is an entry, and hopefully you're either going to click through, and we click through to the original sources a lot. Like, we're trying to send people out there to the original reporting, to additional resources. I mean, that's one of the primary goals of our approach to the editorial. So, yeah, absolutely. We're trying to get people to start here and keep going. I mean, we're trying to capture that interest and encourage it. And I think that is something that all planning processes and all these concepts, it's never going to be able to be just a surface level discussion. So it's always going to have to go further. And the more we can create that expectation or encourage or enable people to go further with their interests, then we'll be succeeding.
Well, I'm also intrigued to hear you talk about how you think that there are stories that people may not click on or may not be the biggest traffic generators, but that people need to be exposed to, and that's kind of, in some ways, seems a very activist approach for a journalist, and yet you clearly feel that there are things that are important, and that you guys have a very clear mission with what you're trying to do in some ways, don't you?
Yeah, I think we generally are able to present both sides. False equivalence is an issue, and there's a lot of bad arguments going around in this realm also. But I certainly present This is a tough one. I don't want to admit to being an activist journalist, but I think I also um, I make it clear when I do have a perspective, and we do certainly. I present all the time arguments that I don't necessarily agree with, but that I think are still valuable, either to understand the nature of the argument or that they're making some good points that need to be taken into account. Um, so yeah, there are also, I think I'm resisting groupthink to a certain extent. If that's activist, then that, I think I'll admit to that. There are certain buzzwords and there are certain themes that get picked up, and you can see the kind of sites that do this, or not all sites do this all the time, but once you read a lot of this stuff, you start to just notice the tricks, and there are obvious themes that people are interested in, and that immediately gather a lot of views or attention or engagement, and it's not always the most substantive or the most obvious ways to make a difference. And I'm trying to, I hope that one of my loftier ideals for the site would be that groupthink is a little less pervasive in this field. If you read this every day.
That's a fascinating perspective, and it is. I think that you guys, because you're a specific avenue for a specific topic, you probably don't see quite the same level of politicization that the national media has seen. But I imagine that there's still a fair amount to that, and you have to be careful and judge what you're going to put out there based on what's going to be thought of it in some ways, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we don't have many resources for fact checking and following up on on the same kind of well-researched articles that you might see in other places. But we do have, because we've been doing this, we do 10 posts a day, every day, 5 on the weekends. We've been doing this since 2000. And I've posted thousands of articles to the internet, and we have a history and an expertise with this on a day-to-day basis. It gets easy to locate the more valued contributors and the people that you need to be a little more wary about. But we do evaluate those new perspectives are always valuable. So we're going to evaluate them as well as we can to see if they need to be part of the conversation. And there's a team of us doing this, and we certainly respond to feedback that we get online. I've got a lot of lessons filed away from mistakes I've made in the past, and it's an ongoing process all the time. But we certainly hope to encourage new voices to get in there also.
That's such an interesting thing, because I think I can trace that back to community work in some ways, and that there are these people that show up at every community meeting that you have, and they're usually the ones that you just roll your eyes when they get up to say something, because you're probably going to know that's going to touch on X, Y, and Z, and you probably don't care about it. And yet that doesn't mean that every once in a while, or even fairly often, that they don't say something that's valuable and that needs to be accounted for, and it changes the conversation in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And that some of the people who are just as guilty of repeating themselves are the politicians that are on stage. So that it's tough to judge the gadflies, as we call them, or as many people call them. Any for that, they have an interest and they're trying to make themselves heard, and you have to respect that. But And I think every person deserves the same amount of, or maybe not the same exact amount, but it deserves a measure of respect and a measure of critical thinking in response to what they're saying, and that's really the key. I hope that when we're doing that critical thinking and just choosing something to share with our audience, and I hope that that's another sort of tendency or another ideal that we uphold, that people are picking up on, and that they're doing the same thing when they're reading our site or any other site.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Well, I'm interested. I think that we've seen an explosion in this kind of, whether it's new urbanism or tactical urbanism or whatever you want to call it. This idea of the devolving of the power to create great communities back to the people that live in them, and I in some ways I want to say that you guys are in part responsible for that by communicating what other communities are doing and channeling those stories so that everyone can see them. Is that part of your role, is to help share those success stories so that other communities can kind of contextualize them and use what's valuable there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough to find those success stories, and that's when we find them. Absolutely, we're going to celebrate them by sharing them and point out, the specifics of the outcomes that have measured the success. And it's tough to find successes. There are some big problems that people are working on that there aren't any clear answers to how to solve this. I mean, the housing crisis, gentrification, displacement. There's the transit ridership is dropping. The pollution from automobiles is increasing. You have cities where the exact opposite dynamics are at work, where they're losing population and they're trying to keep jobs and services up and running in those cities. There's just some really difficult problems that there is no blueprint or silver bullet for solving, and people are desperate for a record of success in what's worked in these places challenged like this. So yeah, that's absolutely one of our goals. And I think it's really important to acknowledge those successes so that other places struggling with the same issues have a model to work with. It's never going to be the exact same thing. A solution for Pittsburgh is not a solution for Boston, but still we need to have that record and that archive of both successes and failures to get started in working on new projects.
I'm glad you mentioned the failure piece as well, because I think that's perhaps equally, or if not more important, to know, hey, before I get started on this, I know that this other community tried this and it was an abject failure, and actually, instead of fixing the housing crisis, made it way worse.
Yeah, and there's arguments on both sides of a lot of the policy specifics on stuff like this. So, Philadelphia, for instance, earlier this week postponed a vote on an inclusionary zoning housing policy. Just to explain, in case anybody's not aware of what inclusionary zoning is, that's where you require a certain amount of affordable housing to be built in any sort of project. It's a mandated requirement of any new development or major renovations, right? So that is one of the most popular tools in cities all over the country to ensure that housing that's affordable to middle or low income people is being built. Otherwise, it might not get built. And that tons of cities are adopting this, and Philadelphia came very close this week. But there's also a lot of people arguing that that's not a good way to do it, that you're actually going to make it harder to build affordable housing in the long run or even in the short term. And then you might not build enough housing at all. And these are incredibly nuanced arguments, and there's record of failure and success in some cities and on both sides, and it's really tough to know. And then you bring in the politics and the interests of the stakeholders, the building industry, the development industry, communities that are concerned about gentrification or displacement, and it just becomes very difficult. You have to have an understanding of some or all of the sides of this argument before talking about how you're going to solve these problems.
Well, so I think that, you guys are certainly part of facilitating that conversation about where that future goes in terms of let's make sure that these issues don't go away, and we keep adding more and more data to our understanding of how issues work. But you also, it's interesting to me that you mentioned earlier the comment section and having a robust comment section, and yet we often see that those social media or those comment sections are not particularly productive places to rely on or have those conversations. Do you think that there's hope in that, or that really we don't know how to make those places as productive as they could be?
I think that a lot of it comes down to your personal approach to whatever platform it is. The two examples that are most prominent for me is that, I used to work at Curbed LA, and there was a point where they shut down comments at that site, and it had gotten pretty bad. It was definitely a place, a safe place for racists and homophobes and just some really bad stuff. And that when they shut it down, though, it turned a lot of people off, and it wasn't because they were there to see that kind of discussion, but they still found a lot of value in other things. And there are definitely some experts engaging on those platforms. The other example I would say is that Twitter can be really different things. And I don't know how I would do my job or stay educated about the important conversations going on in planning without Twitter. And I am certainly aware of the fact that Twitter can be a cesspool, and but I also know how to stay away from that. And that just might be what it takes for people. And I get so much value from Twitter that I have to remind myself sometimes that it can be a cesspool. And you just, you can find the conversations, and you can even find civil conversations with people who you don't agree with, and that you might still benefit from hearing their point of view. I mean, that kind of thing is totally available on these platforms. I can't speak as much to Facebook. Reddit is pretty good for planning. So in answer to your real question is, I'm still hopeful that these platforms hold a tremendous amount of value and can be a real source for inspiration and intelligence in the future.
Well, kind of building on that, I wonder if you have thoughts about kind of where the future of placemaking, planning, community development, city building, where that journalism is headed in the future.
The journalism is tough. I spoke at an event 2 weekends ago, and it was about the advancements that platforms are making with technology in presenting information. And most of the cutting edge stuff was about making really short videos. And we were cutting edge at one point. We were one of the first websites to launch an open source technology platform. It's called Drupal, and that empowered us really to get on the internet and present information on a steady basis in a way that really, a lot of individuals hadn't figured out how to do. Now more and more people have those kinds of resources. Drupal is similar to WordPress or Squarespace or some of these other technology platforms that you have. Drupal's open source. But we redesigned our website. We're constantly trying to look for ways to improve our site and make it more appealing and get this information to the people that want and need it. But there's this whole other parallel cycle of innovation going on in entertainment and in some of the mainstream news, where you're starting to see more entertainment type products getting sort of integrated into the traditional news platforms. So it's really, I don't know the answer to that question. If I did, I would be upset, but you do see, it's a little bit concerning to see some of these platforms and some of the big corporate platforms reducing stories to 6-second videos and or to Snapchat streams and stuff like that. And all you can do is hope that they're holding themselves to the same sort of journalistic standards that the New York Times is, or anything like that. And a savvy reader should be able to evaluate it like that and make conclusions about the content they're consuming. But it's definitely it's going to be tough. It's going to be, in the next 5 or 10 years, it's probably going to be a whole new landscape again.
Do you, is there, I think that part of what I think I go back to with these conversations is that there's always more complexity than we think there is when we first look at an issue. And that's always going to be hard, I think, for journalists to deal with, because you almost never have the amount of time that you want to do with that. But to shorten things into these films seems to be even more reducing the complexity that's shared with folks in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of hard work that goes into making choices so that you can shorten things. I mean, that's the role of editors, anyways. I mean, there usually are options for how you can edit a sentence or improve a sentence to make it more brief and more clear, and usually those things go together, right? Mm-hmm. So there are options, but still, you it's totally understandable to be skeptical that people are putting that type of rigor into the content they're creating. And certainly, the volume requirements that all journalists are working with, at a daily newspaper, your beat reporters are responsible for more inches and more words of that paper with every passing year. Bloggers certainly are getting paid very little money to produce content every single day, and competing in a marketplace that just, there's tons of other people that can write the heck out of a blog post, competing for attention, and the pressure is just to work fast and also be brilliant at what you do. And it's really a challenge, and it drives a lot of people away. I think it's not just the lack of pay, it's just the extreme difficulty in maintaining this kind of pace.
So I'm interested then to hear your thoughts for people that, maybe they're doing work in communities, or maybe they see folks in their communities doing interesting work and they want to help articulate and share that stuff with others. Because I think we're getting to a point where we understand it's important to share our successes and our failures and our lessons. But as you say, the marketplace is becoming incredibly crowded with this kind of information. And how do you go about, well articulating that stuff? Or is there a way to start kind of thinking about those things?
This is going to be kind of a general answer, but hopefully people can make sense of it. I think the two things you have to start out with are, asking who your audience is and how you can, what kind of information they need to understand what you're talking about. So you have to be extremely rigorous with making choices about what you need to define and what in defining you're going to patronize and offend your audience with. I mean, there's a lot of different considerations that go into that, but the audience has to be one of the first. The other one is really just being clear about what the problem is. I think you can't talk about solutions until you have identified the problem, and if you can't identify the problem, then you have to wonder why you're talking about it at all. So I think that those are the two sort of touchstones that I go back to a lot when I'm starting to write or choosing an article. What's the problem that needs to be solved, and what's the audience, and how can I present this information to this audience in a way that might inform them or arm them to start to deal with this problem.
And then, on that flip side, for those of us that are looking to learn from those things that others are putting out there, is there, are there lessons that you could kind of share in terms of how, in this day when we have the option to do everything, kind of, what should we be looking for when we're consuming news and when we're looking for new and insightful places to learn from?
I think it's in the presentation of the information. I mean, it needs to be clear, and there are some writer tricks that you could, or they're not tricks, they're the fundamentals of good writing. But this goes into the images and the infographics that people are choosing, and you have to start to locate the signs that somebody really has a full grasp on what they're talking about. And there's a saying that you shouldn't write about something unless you really understand it, the saying goes something like that. And we certainly, when you hear people talking and they're not making sense, it's a lot of times it's because they don't understand it. And I think that when you're reading, if I could give one clue to your audience as to where they should start, is always start with the verbs. So, if you see a lot of repetitive use of vague verbs, then you can start to understand that maybe the writer isn't fully equipped to be talking about the subject matter. Infographics, you can start to, you have to look at the y-axis and the terms that are using and where the data is coming from. There are just places that you can start with to get an idea of how you should be interacting with the information you're reading.
Fascinating. Well, I kind of want to shift directions here, but that's a fascinating.
Sure.
I've never thought of looking at the verbs before, but I love that kind of perspective on things.
Yeah.
But before we kind of got on air, you were talking, and it struck me that you're very much in some ways a generalist. That you're not a transportation person, you're not a long-term planning person, you're not a housing person. You kind of have your foot on the pulse of many of these different things. And so I'm wondering, when you go to a new place or when you're looking at places, even from afar, what kind of indicators do you look for that a place is doing well or thriving?
I think that the first indicator has to be equality, and that's going to reveal something about my politics. But I just that's what I believe, and that's what I'm going to be looking for. So, do people have access to jobs, good paying jobs, and how are the people who are maybe just entering the workforce for whatever reason, or entering the housing market for whatever reason, what kind of access do they have to, a high quality of life? And the first thing I have to do is listen if I'm coming to a new place. And this has been one of the best parts about my job. I was in all the positions I had before as a journalist, I was writing about Los Angeles or cities in the state of California. And to find myself writing about St. Louis and Cincinnati and Philadelphia within weeks of coming to Planetizen, it was a shock, and it was hard to locate some of the stuff. But I found so much to be inspired by and to be interested in these other cities. And this has been one of the biggest takeaways for me, is that I'm happy to be a generalist to some extent, because I get to learn so many more things about these places. And so, yeah, that's one of the fun parts, I think, is getting to approach that. And so as long as you take those as opportunities, as you take these new terms or new places that come to your attention in the process of doing your work, as long as you take that as an opportunity, then I think you'll be okay in the end, and you'll figure it out.
That's interesting, because I don't think I'd put two and two together till I was hearing you talk here. But in some ways, that in order to be a good journalist or a good newcomer in any community, really, you have to be good at listening. And in some ways, that means listening without thinking you know the answers when you come into a place, which is this brings to mind this incredible thing where journalists have to be the most humble people in any conversation, just from the very fact of what they're doing, which I love that kind of thought in some ways.
Yeah, sure. And I think it gets very obvious when people aren't approaching it that way. Some of the natural disasters that have happened in the last year, maybe specifically talking about Houston with Harvey, to have people from New York with their own, or certainly San Francisco or Los Angeles or anywhere else really, with their own political point of view, trying to tell Houston what they should do with their land use and zoning practices in the wake of this horrible disaster. that's not listening, and that's not really taking into account the situation of Houston, and that's only trying to, you know, project your politics onto that other place, and it's usually really obvious when somebody's making that mistake of not listening and starting with their own opinion first.
Well, it's you've mentioned several times now between the wildfire and the natural disaster stuff here. This stuff that kind of in my mind goes back to resilience stuff.
Uh-huh.
Is that a trend that you only see growing moving forward? Is this kind of move towards resilient thinking?
I hope so. And certainly there are new institutions, a lot of philanthropic giving, and there is much more awareness about resilience and what that means and how to implement it. But it's also another one of those terms that's in danger of being misused for political purposes or for, press release purposes. Some of the splashiest renderings that came out of Superstorm Sandy in New York have not progressed at all. And, all this excitement around potentially a new era of resilience and green infrastructure in New York might have been better served by presenting more humble ambitions and deliverable ambitions. These are always questions that need to be renegotiated with any type of big infrastructure project or big planning project. If by going too far, will we do damage to this cause? And resilience is certainly one of those causes. It's very easy for a politician to stand up there and say they're doing these things, but we need to see proof, and that's something that's pretty hard to argue. That climate change is real. That we need to start thinking about how we're going to adapt to the new weather conditions and new weather patterns. And we need to see real progress, not just press release progress.
That's so fascinating to me because it raises this really interesting question of we often think of a crisis as the time when things can change, but I think what I'm hearing from you is that reality is a crisis is when something needs to happen immediately, and so that time for when change needed to happen was that 10, 100 years prior to that crisis when you were coming up with the new system that you could put in place when the opportunity arose in some ways.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell, and if we're doing the right thing at all with this. And with the pace of technological innovation, it seems like a lot of people are maybe just hoping we're gonna innovate our way out of some of these problems. But the need is obvious. I mean, after Superstorm Sandy or Katrina, or the wildfires in California, all over the West, actually, in the last forever, really. But the crisis is already here, and there are other crises too. That homelessness is another really good example where people are talking about solutions but not delivering, and these are problems that need to be solved yesterday.
It is, and it's I think to go back to kind of an earlier point, it's hard to know. We don't really seem to have the answers to some of these things, and so the homelessness thing. It's there's a lot of people that have come up with borderline interesting solutions, but most of them haven't panned out in some way, and probably we should know that most of them are not going to pan out. But you got to hope that someone's going to follow through and be the right person to walk the walk.
Yeah, homelessness is a really good example of where there are success stories, but they don't apply everywhere. Mm-hmm. Utah gets a lot of credit for having sort of solved homelessness, but the scale of the problem and the nature of the problem, there's different types of homelessness, and there are different approaches to either of them. So the Utah situation doesn't apply in a city like San Francisco or Los Angeles, where you're talking about tens of thousands of homeless people. It's no answers, no easy answers in this world.
Well, it is, and there are success stories from here in Roanoke, where I'm based. That a couple of years ago we got to virtual, whatever the technical term is, but zero veterans homelessness, which was a huge success story. But
absolutely.
At the same time, that's not even solving all of our community's issues with homelessness, much less some other community that has very different challenges in many ways.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
Um, well, I wonder, kind of as we get towards the end here, if you could tell us something that you've kind of learned along the way of being engaged with these issues that maybe you didn't expect to learn, or something that kind of changed your perspective on things.
I think probably one of the biggest ones is my understanding of transit systems. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I took BART, and I took our local buses to school a lot when I was much younger, to middle school and high school. But in learning more about transit systems around the country and around the world, and then actually working in a location that it made sense for me to take the bus to work every day, my perspectives about transit have just completely changed. And I think that if some of your readers are really interested in making the world a better place in some really specific and tangible way, transit is one of the best ways to do it. And it's also a situation where the answers aren't clear, but there are a lot of ways that we can improve the existing transit system, and in a not too expensive of a way. I'm not talking about any sort of plan promoted by Elon Musk or or anything like that. I'm also not necessarily talking about self-driving cars or anything like that. I'm talking about giving more priority to buses and also to bike riders and other forms of alternative transit. And there are a lot of little things you can do to make the existing transit system work a lot better for the people that use it. And I'm not thinking of myself, although I would certainly benefit from better transit systems. There are just so many people that deserve better when getting to and from work and home, and also just going about their daily lives. And it's only lack of awareness. I think there are a lot more people that would be behind these causes if they just understood them a little bit better.
Oh, that feels all too true. It's this idea of what creates a better place. That's in the name of what the podcast is, and yet, well, it's become very clear that it's harder and harder to define that. And yet, you also feel that if more and more people would engage in the issue, that in some ways, creating a shared vision would somehow both be more difficult but way more rewarding at the same time.
Yep. Yeah, I think, man, if people, there's so many issues I think that could be solved if people just took the bus regularly, maybe just once a week or whatever, just to be exposed to what it takes to navigate the city like that. If we could convince 10% more whatever city you're in to take the bus once a week, that could really further a lot the quality of a lot of our discussions.
Now, I wonder if you could kind of wrap us up after this great advice. You hear that, listeners? Everyone should ride the bus at least once a week. I'll take you up on this, James. But I wonder if you could kind of wrap us up with a story of what can happen when a community works well, or what a story of a time that a community did function well.
I want to be specific. It's hard to find unequivocal success. One community's success is another community's threat. I'm thinking of a lot of the places in Los Angeles that have obviously improved in terms of public safety and public health. They had to push people away to achieve that. Even the river, which has seen some amazing public space additions. And the LA River is a channelized concrete storm water drain, in effect. And there's been a real movement to open up public space along the river, and bike lanes and parks. And there's a lot of concern about rising housing prices around those public space investments. I am looking for an unequivocal, getting it right story, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'm sorry about that, but I think that's part of what I'm trying to say, is that you just you always have to think about the other side. It's really, and I think that this is one of the real threats to quality conversations and to actually getting to the desired outcomes, is that you only see it through your lens. And I think that there are a lot of, people that call themselves urbanists in Los Angeles and other cities that are seeing these places that surely are healthier and safer and more prosperous places than they were before. But that doesn't mean that worked for everyone. And at some point you have to decide whether the priority should be on the place or on the people. And we need to make sure that the people that have been displaced by these processes or whatever it is are going someplace, better or safer. And that's not always the case. So I'm sorry I didn't answer your question in the most positive light, but maybe I'll have to comment on this podcast after when I think of something off the top of my head.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective, because I think you're absolutely right, and that I don't know, even within my own experience, I take great pride in some of the work that we've done here in Roanoke, but at the same time, I know that it's not as inclusive, it's not as diverse, it's not as powerful as we'd like it to be, and yet, it becomes incredibly difficult to define success, and these are all really important conversations that make these, defining what is good, what is better, what is best, really difficult, but it doesn't make it any less likely that we need to do the work in some ways.
Yeah, there's always that question of when you should settle, and I think you just always have to keep pushing for more, for more and better, and once you settle, that's when you've failed that mission.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, James. Where can you direct people to the website, and where else they might be able to find more information about what you guys are up to?
Yeah, the planetizen.com, and that's Planetizen. And it's okay if you forget how to pronounce that right after this podcast is over, but it's a recognizable brand when you get to the site. And I'm also on Twitter, and I'd be glad to hear any sort of feedback from anyone who's listening. I'm at Casual Brasuell, and I'm always on Twitter pretty much all day, every day, and that's how I get the work done. So, and I'll be happy to talk to you if you think I was wrong about some stuff, or you think I can refine my approach to some of these things. I'd certainly be happy to hear that.
Well, James, thank you so much again for taking the time. If you guys are interested in CityWorks Expo, you can find out more about us at cityworksxpo.com, and then also on all the social media platforms. But James, thank you so much for taking the time, and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksxpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.